Hey friends, this is the guided practice for your mentor text. We read earlier Pro Con Should America Allow Inmates to Vote Behind Bars, which is written by Amani Shawari and Meryl Matthews. Now, this article looks a little bit different from your average argumentative essay because this presents both the pro side of the argument as well as the con. So, why you should be for the argument and why you should be against the argument. So, it also presents these different aspects of this argument from two different authors. We have Amani Sharari, who writes the pro side, and Meryl Matthews, who writes the con side. So when we look at this article, it's organized and separated between pro and con. So first, we're going to look at the pro side. So pro, we already have our claim statement written out for us. Taking away the vote of prisoners is robbing them of their civil rights. So Amani Sharari takes this main claim and then breaks it down throughout his section of this article. So first breakdown point. In the United States, there has never been a time when all citizens could vote. So he's preaching to the fact that all citizens, no matter who you are, should be able to vote. So evidence he uses to support that is around the idea that it wasn't until 1870 that Black men were allowed to vote. Women were first allowed to vote in 1920. And less than 100 years ago, all Native Americans were finally allowed to vote. So we see some evidence sitting there to be able to support this idea that at any given time in the United States, all citizens have never been able to vote. And is that really right? Have we been robbing people of their civil rights the whole time? Ultimately, Amani Sharari wants you to think that. Another aspect of our claim is that more Americans have realized that our democracy is flawed. Taking away the vote of prisoners is robbing them of civil rights. Again, going back to this idea that we used to rob Black men and women and Native Americans of their civil right to vote. Why are we now doing that to prisoners? He supports this by saying there are other democratic nations, there are other nations outside the United States that actually allow their prisoners to vote. And if we're supposed to be a superpower, then shouldn't we be like these countries? So he lists out countries like Canada, Israel, Germany, Norway, South Africa, and Spain. The last aspect of his claim is that our nation is too focused on punishment. If we give all citizens a vote, we can help inmates rehab while in prison and rebuild their trust in government. So, in a nutshell, Amani Shawari is saying we should give prisoners the right to vote because we should always be giving all citizens in the United States the right to vote and practice their civil rights. The con side, written by Meryl Matthews. His main counterclaim to that is that murderers and other prisoners give up their right to vote once they are convicted. So he plays on emotion within his section of this article. So he starts his claim by introducing this guy named King. In 1998, King murdered James Byrd Jr., a Black man. King chained Byrd to the back of a truck and dragged him to death. King lost civil rights and freedoms in prison, including his vote. So he plays on emotion, this idea that most reasonable people will be extremely taken off guard by learning that someone has murdered someone by dragging them behind a car. So he uses some evidence to introduce exactly who this guy is before he presents this aspect of his claim, which is on April 24th, Texas executed white supremacist John William Bill King. He was a murderer, yet Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders says he should have also been a voter. So again, he's playing on emotions. He's essentially saying if we think about people like King and people like terrorists during 9/11, if we think about if we think about the Boston Marathon bomber, all these people have done really bad things and ultimately they've killed maybe one person or maybe even multiple people. And why should we give them the right to vote if they've taken away that right from other people? So he actually gets right to that. If King had a right to vote in Texas, he likely would have supported certain candidates. They would have been politicians who could help him. Those candidates would want to lighten sentences for people like him. These are prisoners who have committed hate crimes and murder. So again, he's saying and pushing forth this idea that if we allow prisoners to vote, we're allowing people who do really heinous crimes, really bad crimes, really horrible crimes, we're allowing them to have a say in what we do as reasonable people in this country, despite the fact that they've proven that they aren't necessarily reasonable if they're willing to kill and murder and things of that nature. So he supports this idea that if we allow prisoners to vote, then that means that they can also elect politicians that could help them and vote on laws that would actually be benefiting criminals more than anyone else. So he mentions how the US Bureau of Justice Statistics reports that 1.5 million prisoners existed in 2016 in the United States, which means ultimately that vote matters. Like if we think about the popular vote in the Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump election, I don't know the exact number, friends, but it was a number around that range that would have been the difference between Hillary Clinton being our president versus Donald Trump. So the last aspect of his claim is that Byrd was never able to vote again because King killed him. So why should King and others guilty of crimes like murder be allowed to vote? What is the reason? Why does that make sense? So he uses some evidence around some different states and cities that have actually allowed prisoners to vote. So he mentions the 14 states that give felons the right to vote upon their release of prison, which information he got from the National Council of State Legislators. He mentions Washington, D.C., Maine, Vermont, things of that nature to help support this idea that actually allowing prisoners to vote is something that we do in the United States, but is it something that we should do across the United States? So, for instance, however, Vermont is a rural state that's next to last in population. The state has the lowest crime rate, including the US Crime Index, which means ultimately, yeah, it's okay for states like Vermont to allow citizens who have been previously incarcerated or previously were prisoners, it's okay to allow them to vote because it's less likely that they're doing crimes as heinous as the guy that he mentioned at the very beginning, King, this white supremacist. So ultimately, friends, at the end of the day, whenever you're looking at an argumentative essay, you want to look through it to identify what is your claim and is there a counterclaim. So in this essay, we identified that we have equally suited claim and counterclaim. We have a pro and we have a con. So we want to identify that claim, that counterclaim, and then we want to think about what is the evidence that is used to support that claim? How is it connected? How is it elaborated on? So, friends, a lot of how this was elaborated on, I made those connections, right? I was able to describe to you, well, this is the claim which is connected to this evidence. It was almost like seamless, if you will. So, if we go back and we look, whenever we're presenting one aspect of our claim, where these arrows are, we very often see a piece of evidence very close to it, whether it's before it or after it. So, friends, this has been your guided practice for pro-con should America allow inmates to vote behind bars. I hope this makes you understand a bit more how we identify, claim, evidence, and elaboration in our argumentative essays. But more importantly, I hope this empowers you to write your own super strong argumentative essays.